Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening. How are you? And from wherever you are, from across the world. So, I'm going to present, of course, the Global Youth Climate Action Fund proposal. Apologies, we're supposed to present it, of course, earlier on, like I think 6 hours ago, but due to a bit of schedule issues, this is now the opportune time that we're going to unpack the Global Youth Climate Action Fund institutional proposal. So my name is Dolphin Magero, and I'm glad to have you here to join me. And feel free to ask questions, share comments on the screen, and we'll ensure that we're able to get back to you. So without much further ado, I'll skip right into the proposal. Ladies and gentlemen, so this is the Global Youth Climate Action Fund institutional proposal. So my name, like I introduced myself, is Dolphin Magero. So the Global Youth Climate Action Fund is hosted and not run by Drop Access. Our website is down there, www.gykafund.org. So a bit of background information. So I'd like to introduce where the concept of youth and climate finance first came to be. So at the 14th Conference of Youth, which coincided with the 24th Conference of Parties, young people gathered at the University of Silesia to prepare on a meaningful engagement at 24th Conference of Parties. So one of the key major outputs of this convening of young people was the Global Youth Policy Position, that paper that was presented to the COP24 presidency at the end of the 14th Global Conference of Youth. So the Global Policy Position paper, it was sort of young people trying to sort of align with themselves with existing policies. So it is the first ever, the closest that young people have ever gone, basically, to developing a policy on climate change. So it captured aspects such as finance, adaptation, mitigation, Talanoa dialogue, and other key outputs. So the Talanoa dialogue, as we all know, it coins from a Fijian word meaning where we are, where we want to go, and how we want to get there. So under this section within this Global Youth Policy Position paper, the issue of basically driving engagement and of course issues of climate finance started to crop up basically at the 14th Conference of Youth in 2018 at the University of Silesia. So there was a bit of deliberations on how young people, where basically young people wanted to see the world go uh, in light of the 2023 global stocktake. And one of the things for us to get there, and it was also going to look at the 2028 global stocktake, it was also going to look at, so it came into being that climate finance was very critical basically, and climate education to support young people basically to be able to support meaningful engagement on climate change towards 2023 and towards 2028. So introduction. So in June of 2020, a coalition of youth organizations, of course, some of them members of the Yungo platform, began an initiative to capacity build young people on climate finance and carbon pricing. So this was in a bid to keep momentum in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, which saw no COP engagement, which saw a lot of drag in engagement on climate change and climate finance issues, basically. And this was critical because uh, COP26 was supposed to be, it was, of course, the financial COP, the year when we were going to check whether the international community had met their Paris Agreement financial commitment of $100 billion to support developing countries to meet their adaptation and mitigation needs. So the birth of the Global Youth Climate Action Fund initiative, which sought to mobilize finance for young people up to 2030. So at that point, it was championed by BLI Global and Drop Access. So in June or in November of 2021, uh, the idea, the concept of a youth fund became more vivid, basically, and that is when the idea of an independent fund institution came about to be. And this is what we are going to discuss today, and we are going to give you room to be able to unpack and understand, and if possible, come on board and support this particular agenda. On this slide, I'm going to unpack the concept of youth finance. I'm calling it the economics of youth climate finance. So it is still theoretical and not proven. So here I try to give mathematical expression of why young people need to be given resources to act on climate change. So when you look at the sustainable development from environmental class, it's development that seeks to meet the needs of the current generation without compromising the ability of the future generation to meet their needs. So therefore, sustainable development, the current generation over is always over the younger generation. So that's how we would, of course, express sustainable development, because the younger generation are always going to be more compared to the younger generation. So if it were um, uh, an, a fraction, then the current generation will be the upper 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 number, and the younger generation with the lower number. So in a graph of y against x, of course, y representing the younger generation and x representing the older generation, when we know that y is always going to be greater than x, then it would be y is equals to mx plus c, where the value of m at this particular point is expressed as the needs of the current generation. So the needs of the current generation can be expressed through, for example, the needs of the current generation in terms of the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. It can also be expressed in terms of the nationally determined contribution, basically any plans, African Agenda 2063, any plans that a country or an institution or an organization sets out to support development. Then the value of C would be, of course, equated to environmental or climate finance. So when you look at this graph, it is only with the youth demographic that is possible, because we know that within the climate change and environmental engagement, we have a lot of stakeholders. We have the youth, we have the gender, we have the civil society, we have every cohort of people. So the point I'm trying to bring across is youth is a cross-cutting cohort, basically, because we have youth in every sector. Think about it. We have youth in government, we have youth in civil society, youth in private sector, youth in the gender group, youth in basically in the marginalized community. Youth are in every cohort of young people, and youth will tend to shift. Some will move from the private sector to the public sector, to civil society, to government, and back and forth. So youth is a unique cohort of young people. So this mathematical expression is seeking to bring out young people as a unique cohort of young people. So when we have our equation of y is equals to mx plus c, so this is still mathematical equation basically, where the value of y, of course, is the younger generation, m is the needs, x is the older generation, and c is the environmental or climate change needs. When the value of y is equals to 0, y is equals to 0 simply means that there are no younger generation. It means that uh, basically our parents did not give birth to we who exist now. Then in that particular scenario, then mx would therefore be equal to negative c. This means that the development plans, the Agenda 2063, once the government should not even renew their NDCs, basically. And if they don't, it means there is no need to renew or make any more plans, because there are no younger people to basically who need these plans to support their engagement in, of course, the next decade. So it basically means that the plans that we make today, for example, the NDCs that most come to a conclusion in 2030, we should not go make another new NDCs post 2030, or we should not have the new collective quantified goal basically we call it the post 2025 financial goal. So this is what we mean by case scenario one, which is very unrealistic, unfair, and it actually negates the Rio Summit of 1992, which of course puts an X on the Brundtland report. Then we're going to look at case scenario two, when x is equals to 0. So this is a bit of mathematical expression. When x is equals to 0, this is close to an impossible situation because x represents the older generation. When x is equals to 0, the whole system collapses simply because when x is equals to 0, it means when there are no older generation, then it means there are no younger generation. It means there are no plants. It means there is no climate change. It means there is no environmental change. So basically, human beings fail to exist. So this is also an impossible situation because the older generation already exists, and it is an impossible situation. We'll move on to case scenario 3. Now, case scenario 3, I like to compare it with LTF discussions. LTF, for those who don't know, is called long-term finance, where developed countries are trying to push for end of long-term finance discussions, and which means end of long-term finance mobilization, and developing countries are trying to uh, extend negotiations basically to a future not specified, basically to not stop discussions on climate financing. So when C is equals to 0, so when C is equals to 0, uh, this one represents the LTF discussions, long-term finance discussion. It means Y is equals to MX, basically. So it means that the younger generation, of course, uh, the older generation, the plans that have been made for the older generation, basically, uh, they 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 will be enough to support the younger generation in the next decade, in the next century. Like for example, the Sustainable Development Goals. I think I should use that one, set for 2030. When we get to 2030, we who are the younger generation, of course, we will not need to sort of create more plans, basically like a post 2030 goal or issues like that. So this is also quite an impossible situation because we know that uh, the every day the population is growing, especially for developing countries like Africa, Asia, and South America. So when the population keeps growing for Africa, Asia, and South America, the needs and the demands seem to go up. So every time there is need to periodically review the plans and the needs for a particular country, region, and of course the international community has to keep reviewing this. So this scenario is also a bit tricky because it basically says that whatever the older generation is doing, they should keep doing it, and we should not think about the impact that it has on the environment, which is very unfortunate, basically for this particular environment. So this one sort of represents unsustainable development, a development that is not taking into consideration environmental issues. It is not an environmental conscious sort of development. So it does not follow the green growth model or green growth approach. Then of course we'll have the case scenario 4, when m is equals to 0. When m is equals to 0, it means that it is also an impossible situation. It means that y is equals to c. So young people is equals to u. Basically, what this equation is trying to express is that when m is equals to 0, it means that we go back to the Stone Age period. We reverse time back to the Stone Age period, where man remained the way it was. Man did not advance himself or herself, basically. So basically, an era where man sort of did not even invent fire, discover fire, cook. So everything remained the same, and we did not sort of utilize the natural resources for our economic advancement and development. So there are no buildings, there are no nothing. We go back to a time when before we started to develop, and we continue like that. And that is also impossible because we can never reverse time back. And man is an ever evolving creature. So it is impossible to not tell man to evolve, basically. So on this next slide, I'm going to try to understand the value of M, trying to sort of give the true value of M, because we have tried to sort of give a draft suggestion that y is equals to mx plus c is a mathematical equation for youth and climate finance. So finding the value of M will allow us to be able to calculate basically the environmental and climate change needs that we may need. So in the first column, we have the corresponding conference of parties so that to make it relatable. Then on the second column, we basically have years passed since the first COP. We know that first conference of parties to the Unity Policy began in 1995, so that's about 25 years ago. And then in the next one, we have uh, the year, how many years left to 2030. So 2030 is sort of the timeline basically that the IPCC report indicate that when we get to 2030, the impacts of climate change are going to become irreversible. And then we have the true value of M. So what is the value of M? Equation of y is equals to mx plus c. Then the corresponding year is the exact year. So the exact year is in doubles because we're looking at the COVID pandemic, basically. So the COVID pandemic basically sort of disrupted a year where we did not do anything. It was a global pandemic that disrupted a lot of things. So that is why we begin here with COP 26, and here aligns with 25 and not 26. So when you check out the value of M basically, you can see that the trend is on an upward trajectory. An upward trajectory basically means that uh, the longer we wait, the less action we take on climate change, the higher the financing that we will need, the higher the cost of development, the higher the needs basically to mitigate and adapt, the higher the adaptation and mitigation needs basically, and the higher the cost of climate change, because when the value of M is high, it means that when we take the value of Y, for example, to represent the young population and the value of X to represent the older population, and then we have the value of M on an uprising trajectory, it means that with each passing year, we will need climate finance more and more each and every passing day, because the problems are becoming more and more severe as the days go by. So this is something that I came up with and really looking to advance further to see basically uh, to try and bring to light the urgency of providing financing for young people to act on climate change. So why basically young people? Because the year 2030, which is also the IPCC 1.5 timeline, is most critical to young people because it is the year where some young people might exit the youth cohort and step into the decision-making cohort. Some young people will step into those decisions. So any decisions that are not made by governments today or the older generation today, governments, civil society today, the young people will have to deal with them when they get to 2030, basically. Any decisions made by governments today, the young people in 2030 will either reap from the decisions that are made today, or they will live with the effects of those decisions if they were negative. So it is a very critical and time, especially for young people, especially those in sub-Saharan Africa and also in the other LDC, other developing countries, basically in Asia, Latin America, basically, especially those young people, because we know that they have underlying challenges that make it even harder for them to address climate change, basically. The institutional approach to supporting youth to access climate finance, enhancing transparency in youth climate finance flows. So in this next section, I'm going to explain why should we have an institution, basically, to support young people to access climate finance. And one of the key highlights are given enhancing transparency in youth climate finance flows. And I'll be able to highlight that as the slides go on. So why an independent fund institution? Why am I proposing an independent youth fund institution? So if you go back to the baseline year for environmental issues, that was the Rio Summit or the Earth Summit of 1992. The international community gathered and they agreed that national parties shall of course mobilize 40% of financing at the national level to support the environmental needs, basically. Actually, 60% of financing needed at the national level to support the environmental. Then the international community would mobilize the remaining 40% of global finance required, basically to complement or sort of co-finance. So this saw the setting up of the GEF, that's the Global Environmental Facility. So it is sort of a facility or sort of like an institution that supports the mobilization and the distribution of climate finance flow in a very coordinated manner because it has all the technical and institutional capacity to be able to provide financing to countries when they need it to try and address the environmental and climate change issues. Then when you come again in 2009 at Copenhagen, the international community moved to set up an entity that would mobilize finance for climate action. Today, this entity, also called the Green Climate Fund, has become the largest multilateral agency that supports issues on global at global level on climate change, basically. So the Global Green Climate Fund basically was meant to serve the Paris Agreement. So for those who don't know, the Paris Agreement is one of the conventions under the UNFCCC convention. So from the Rio Earth Summit, the Rio Earth Summit produced three conventions: Convention on Climate Change, Convention on Biodiversity, and Convention on Desertification, and also produced a statement on forest. So under the Convention on Climate Change, we've had the Kyoto Protocol, of course, and also we've had the Paris Agreement. So Paris Agreement is considered the greatest milestone, basically, uh, when it comes to climate change policy engagement at the global level. And to support implementation of this Paris Agreement, the Green Climate Fund was set up basically to support in implementing some of the visions of the Paris Agreement, which include 2 degrees Celsius, basically climate, uh, global temperatures, basically. Yes. So when you look at the Green Climate Fund and the Global Environmental Facility, which are the main financial mechanisms basically supporting climate change issues, they are sort of a facility or an institution. They are not, because these are the only entities that can provide the transparency, tracking, mobilization, distribution of resources, basically, and mobilize and distribute resources, basically, to support climate action initiative, basically an agenda at a global scale within a transparent framework. So how do we envision the Independent Youth Fund institution? We have designed what we call the pillars of the Independent Youth Fund institution. So it has 6 key pillars. We have the donor group, we have the advisory committee group, we have the institutional oval, we have the accredited entities, we have the implementing entities, and we have the executing entities. When we look at the donor group are agencies that are going to provide financial support basically to this particular institution basically. And we're looking at ways of partnership, of course, with the Green Climate Fund, the GEF, and other philanthropic organizations and entities that might have financial resources. When you look at the advisory committee, who is within the advisory committee? This could be agencies that have worked, of course, may have worked with the donor agencies in being able to basically access the resources of those who are who have the global lens, and they can ensure that we keep the agenda global and we don't sort of deviate and nationalize it or make it a regional agenda. So we would include agencies like the UN to help us oversee the running of this particular fund, so that we ensure that we are, of course, sticking to, of course, the agreed channel. Uh, and I'm sorry about that. The GYCAF institutional oval. This is a very interesting part. So when I talk of a GYCAF institutional oval, a youth fund institutional, what do I mean? I would like you to imagine an egg, basically a boiled egg. The egg has two parts, the yolk and the white part. So the oval is like that. So within the oval, basically, the yolk basically would symbolize a youth fund board. So young people from different regions, Africa, Asia, Latin America, all the continents, who sit and decide which projects get funded, how, and basically how much they should get funded. Then of course we have within the egg, a boiled egg, the white part is usually supposed to facilitate or protect, the yolk sort of, so that we would see it as a secretariat basically. So the secretariat basically would facilitate the work of the board and drive coordination basically, so that basically young people, so that there's a smooth process. Young people can have also advisory support from the advisory committee, the donor group, of course, to be able to sort of ensure that operations run smoothly. So that is what we call the institutional oval. Then the accredited entities. Who are the accredited entities? We're looking to set up an independent youth fund institution. We're not looking to antagonize the work that is already existing. We're looking to complement basically what is already existing. So who do we envision as the accredited entities? First of all, we would of course start with uh, our GEF focal point officers and the GCF NDA officers basically, because they have been the process and they can be able to highlight some of the gaps basically that the youth fund could come in and meet. Then of course we'd look at organizations and entities that deal with young people and the younger generation. For example, international organizations, I will not mention that deal with children and young people basically would fit within this particular criteria, to ensure that of course we are keeping we are basically keeping to the environmental and youth agenda basically, and climate financing to support it. So this is what we call the accredited entities. Then the implementing entities. Who are the implementing entities? These are any young person or individuals or groups, NGOs, CSOs, any grouping of young person who wants to have access, who has a project basically that uh, could support adaptation and mitigation, basically agenda and drive it. So these are the implementing entities, those who want to, the young people, how they are going to apply. So they would act as the implementing entities, basically. The executing entities. We know that young people, in as much as we keep saying that now is our time, we need guidance. So executing entities are entities with experience implementing climate change and environmental projects basically. So these are entities, the executing entities are entities that would support the implementing entities to implement the approved projects and processes. Basically, they would sort of guide and act as uh, technical support basically on project implementation to the implementing entities. For example, if you have a youth organization X, then we have the implementing entity Y. So implementing entity, executing entity Y would support the organization implementing the approved project by this particular fund basically, to implement and take the project to the ground. They would support in navigating if there are policies and governments, such sort of issues basically, so that they can be able to drive and implement their climate agenda effectively as they are intended to. How would you like it to link it with other youth organizations dealing with climate change? Of course, we cannot underscore the role of other youth organizations. So the global youth organizations, I want to mention names, would be instrumental in supporting this particular agenda, basically. But I reserve this PowerPoint slide for a specific international youth organization dealing with climate change that we are in discussion with, and I would reserve that to a later date. So I'd beg to skip that. So what is the GYCAF institutional oval? This is how it should look like. So the oval will have, basically we have of course the board here, which represents like the York. Then we'd have of course the secretariat on the other hand. Then the upper end we'd have the donor group, and then the other one we'd have the advisory group. Then we have the chairs of the developing and the developed countries. So the chairs basically and the CEO basically would sort of try to bring harmony between the secretariat work and the board approval and the processes, basically, because the board issues, when you start talk about board issues, is a bit of a political aspect of it. So the board would be considered a more of a political aspect of it, and the chairs of course would be political figures within this particular process. But then we have to come back to the reality that climate change and environmental issues also are technical. So these would be sort of the technical part, the scientific act. So that is sort of the secretariat, because they would provide the technical support needed for swift engagement. So this is what we envision the institution oval to look like and to envision like. So linking it to the national level engagement, this is a very interesting slide. We know that within the international climate change discussions, basically, policies developed at the global level come to be replicated basically once the country is party to that particular convention, basically Convention on Climate Change or the Paris Agreement, they automatically become laws in such kind of countries. So national level engagement is actually critical, basically. And for this next slide, I will request again to have it, to discuss it on the last 3 slides of this PowerPoint presentation. So I'd like to move on to the next slide. The 25-step approach to supporting youth to access climate finance. So when we began the introduction about basically the institutional approach to supporting youth to access climate finance, one of the key highlights was enhancing transparency. So the 25-step approach is looking into issues of transparency, because when you look at youth engagement and issues of financing, not just in climate change, also in the agriculture sector, sometimes it is not that the youth do not have a credible proposal that, of course, that cannot be funding. Sometimes they meet the qualification, but the level of trust basically between the donor and the young person sometimes is often lacking, basically. So the donor might like the idea, might like the agenda, but might not trust the young people with money, because sometimes we are told that young people are unpredictable, young people, we have a lot of issues within ourselves. So this is sort of looking to build partnerships and trust, building on intergenerational partnership. So the 25-step approach is supposed to coordinate basically young people, the advisory committee, of course, the donor group, basically, because we know that most donors are very skeptical about financing, giving finances to young people, because young people they might not trust that, or we might not meet the requirement. But through this 25-step approach, basically, where the institution would receive, of course, the proposal by the young people, by, of course, the applicant or the implementing entities, basically, then this approach, of course, would be taken for review, basically, a couple of review, that's by the regional coordinator, then the environmental specialist, then the specific country coordinator or manager, to check whether it aligns with the national policies, plans, and goals, basically, and whether it fits within that particular context. Then, of course, it would go to the board to be approved. Then, of course, from the board, once it's approved, it would go to the advisory committee, basically. So the advisory committee might have a bit of advice, or might already be working on it, and might seek to complement on what that proposal is seeking to do, basically. Then it would, of course, go to the donor group to inform them that we would like to, of course, we have approved, young people have approved for this amount of financing to go to this particular project in this particular country, and we're going to do it this way, and we're going to be requesting for this amount. So after that, it's sort of trying to build a rapport with the donor. Then, of course, the donor, after that, the funding would get approved, and that would be done in three phases. So that would be phase one. So at the end of phase one, of course, the institution providing technical support will provide monitoring and evaluation, environmental report, and of course, on the overall monitor and environmental report. Then this report, of course, would be brought back within the secretariat. Then, if satisfactory, basically, it would be forwarded to the finance person, of course, who would unlock phase two. So the funding would be broken down into three phases: phase one, phase two, and phase three. Then phase two, after it has been distributed, phase two of the financing or support, the monitoring and evaluation officer and the environmental officer would give a report basically, and then we would check the overall progress of the project, and that would unlock phase three. So the phase three, it would go through the same process until we complete. When we complete it, then the secretariat would compile the report, of course, for phase one, phase two, and phase three, and how much and how it has been used, and whether it's to the satisfaction, presented to the board, to the advisory committee, and of course to the donor party, and then the cycle will repeat itself with as many times as possible. So this could easily be done in 25 steps. So this is a 25-step approach that is looking to build on intergenerational partnership between young people and the older generation and the donor, sort of in a sort of communal approach. It is a communal approach to young people accessing climate finance. Other programs. So the 25-step approach is what we call the direct access program. The indirect access programs, we also have other programs that, of course, the secretariat would design and implement through, of course, the implementing entities, because sometimes young people need to be guided, basically, because not everyone has the capacity to write a proposal or has an organization, basically, that can write a proposal or that can support them to write a proposal. So what are the other indirect access programs that, of course, would be instrumental, basically, in this particular agenda? So we would have, of course, we have the Adaptation for Green Jobs program, Youth for Green Growth program, Technology and Innovation Hub program, Mainstreaming S into Climate and Carbon Finance program, Tracking of Climate Finance Flows program. So these are programs that would be developed, are being developed, of course, by the secretariat, and the secretariat would implement them, of course, in partnership with local youth organizations who are the implementing entities, basically. So I'm going to take us through each one of them step by step on what they entail and how we seek to work with young people and other donor partners to sort of implement some of this particular agenda. So I'm going to take us through each and every one of them. So we have the first one is mainstreaming ACE into climate and carbon finance programs. Just to say something about ACE, for those who don't know, ACE stands for Action for Climate Empowerment. So Action for Climate Empowerment is actually embedded within the UNFCCC and also within the Paris Agreement. So within the Paris Agreement, it is called Article 12. Within the UNFCCC, it is called Article 6. It is also called the Doha Work Program. So given that young people is not an agenda item within the climate change engagement and negotiations, basically, there is a provision through, of course, Article 12 of the Paris Agreement to include young people, basically, in climate change issues, basically in implementation of the Paris Agreement and the Convention. So how are young people included, basically? So the Doha Work Program, ODS, basically, or Article 12 of the Paris Agreement, Article 6 of the United Nations Framework on Climate Change, highlights 6 key areas to include young people. The first is education, basically educating young people on climate change and climate affairs issues. Then we have training of young people. Then we have capacity, public access to information. So, information accessible to these young people, basically. Public participation, are young people participating? Then we have capacity building, and then we have international relations. So the mainstreaming of ACE into the climate and carbon finance issues is sort of looking to train, capacity build young people basically on climate and carbon finance issues basically at a global level. So how do we envision this? We envision this through webinars support that we have already begun, but we're looking to engage at the national level, basically, do a lot of capacity building and training of young people at the national level on climate change and climate finance issues at the national level, subnational level, and at the grassroots level. And what are the outputs? Well, that's very interesting. You must have, of course, you need to subscribe to us and link up with us so that we're able to unpack what are the key outputs and how far along are we towards this sort of support to young people, because without capacity, young people cannot engage basically. If we don't make people aware that there is something called climate finance, how will they be able to apply and try to support themselves to address some of these issues basically that are affecting them and will affect them even in the near future, basically in the 2020 and the post 2030 agenda. The next one is Adaptation for Green Jobs Program. This program is crafted particularly for developing countries with underlying issues that might hinder their efforts to address climate change issues. So, which are these developing countries? They're Africa, Asia, Latin America, South America, basically developing countries. Why Adaptation for Green Jobs Program? Because you'll find that in most of these countries, basically, youth employment is a key challenge, particularly in Africa, basically. And there is need, these are the areas that are being encouraged to shift to the green growth pathway, basically, green economic pathway. These are countries that may have just recently gotten independence for some and are in the process of developing industries. So how can basically we create jobs for young people basically at this particular level and at these particular stages of that of the national and regional development and adaptation. These are areas that need adaptation the most, and we've seen that 93%, according to Climate Policy Initiative Report 2017-2018, 93% of resources mobilized went to mitigation rather than adaptation, which is a challenge because even in these particular areas, they are the least contributors to climate change, but they are the ones suffering the most. They're suffering the most because they have underlying issues, they don't lack support, and no one also again wants to support adaptation. So we are trying to craft a program where we promote adaptation technologies while which promote green jobs for young people basically. So this is something that program that is very dear and we're very keen on basically listening and understanding and see how to support young people and creating green jobs for young people to help them drive green economies. Then we have the Youth for Green Growth Program. So the Youth for Green Growth Program is based on the concept of a green economy basically. Uh, it is heavily reliant on the just transition. So what does just transition mean? So parties, countries, even those that have already developed and are already having industries running, they're being encouraged to shift to cleaner, more renewable sources of energy. But what we're looking at is the opportunities for youth basically within this shift, within this just transition. So this is called the Youth for Green Growth Programs. How can young people be part of this transition, of the just green transition basically? So this program is looking to explore at the global level, regional level, national level, sub-national level. How can young people basically be part of the just transition? How they're transitioning to a greener, cleaner economies, basically to support the green growth agenda, basically. So this program is another interesting one that we're looking to, of course, work with young people from basically all walks, basically, to be able to make them part of the change, be the drivers, basically, of change. Tech and innovation hub. Tech and innovation hub is very critical within this particular agenda because we know that finance flows in three ways: capacity, technology, and partnerships, basically. So, partnership is covered by the 25-step approach, capacity is covered by the mainstreaming of S into climate and carbon finance agenda, and this is technology. Why do we need technology? In as much as we like to talk about climate change basically uh, on paper, on forums, in conferences, in workshops, the reality is climate change impacts are felt at the grassroots level. And the impacts of climate change at the grassroots level, most of this most severe effects of climate change are going to need technology, and not just technology, but green and blue technology to be able to support the right adaptation and mitigation strategies that will support mitigation and adaptation basically. So the technology and innovation hub is looking to incubate basically innovations basically for young people basically that are geared towards addressing the issues of climate change. So it is a hub basically that young people come with their innovations and they're incubated to a level where they can attract financing on their own and be co-financed by the institution itself, of course, using a grant, and then also the institution would support them in give them sort of co-financing when applying to other bigger funds, of course, such as the GCF and the GEF. And what else is the tech and innovation hub providing? It is providing a proposal development program, capacity building young people on how to write proposals that could be funded by the institution itself and also could be considered for co-financing by other big funding entities such as the GCF and the GEF, basically. So the co-financing mechanism, then research, because we know that we cannot be where we are. The Paris Agreement could not have been there without the IPCC and the research and the data. So this is looking to sort of support young people to undertake in-depth research on climate change, innovations, and technology, basically, that could transform the lives of local communities and societies all across the board. So all this is part of the technology and innovation hub. So a tech and innovation hub is very critical because young people are known to be innovative and transformative, and we want to bank on that basically because young people are basically are the drivers basically of change. The tracking of climate finance flows. Tracking, when you look at the ongoing discussions about climate finance, there's a bit of transparency issues, issues of double counting that tend to come up when it comes to issues of climate finance. Basically, sometimes the development aid is counted at climate finance, which is not always the case, or issues like that arise. And we have seen countries try to set up measures and interventions basically that sort of try to track the climate financing. And one of the issues that, of course, uh, create this confusion is lack of a global definition of climate finance, which, of course, the institution would want to define as support given to the younger generation by the older generation to mitigate and adapt to the effects of climate change. So how do we envision tracking? We envision tracking, of course, through setting up the right, uh, the right, the right bodies, uh, engagement, the right frameworks, basically, to be able to follow the resources as they go to basically the ground. So, how do we envision this? we know that within the existing climate change and climate finance mechanism, there are bodies and accounting bodies, coordinating bodies. So the coordinating body basically for climate change issues is the UNFCCC. So the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change convenes, basically coordinates global climate parties, basically private sector, civil society, basically it's the main coordinating bodies. Then of course we have the regional bodies, such as sometimes the Africa Development Bank, which is not always the case. And then we have, of course, at the national level, we have the government basically coordinating issues of climate change, of course, being supported by civil society groups, also that also fall at the national and the regional level. Then we have the county, subnational sort of ministries that tend to coordinate, and then we have the local community coordination. That is issue that has brought about the locally led climate action movement. So that is the sort of coordinating mechanisms that exist. When you look at the accounting bodies, who ensure that the checks and balances are in place at the international level, we have the Green Climate Fund. So the Green Climate Fund board. So the board ensures that resources go to the right channel, go to the right places. Then we have the GEF Council, the Global Environmental Facility Council. The council approves which projects goes where. Then at the regional level, I think we should have the CAOS, Committee of Africa Heads of State on climate or on climate change. This one should also go hand in hand, of course. In Africa, I think there's an Africa Climate Change Fund, so it should have a board. Though I'm yet to know how this board would, of course, operationalize or how things operate within the regional level. It is not still clear. Then at the national level, giving a case scenario for Kenya basically, but could be replicated to other countries, we have the National Climate Change Council, the council that is supposed to sort of account ensure that checks and balances are put in place. Then we have the Subnational Climate Change Fund Board. So we have a board that ensures that resources set aside for climate change at the subnational level go to its intended use and is not wasted, because coming across financing is already a challenge, and we want to ensure that whatever is already there goes into the right channel. Then we have the climate change fund committees, of course, climate change committees at the very subnational level. So what are the financial mechanisms that exist? We have the GCF and the GEF. We have the Africa Climate Change Fund. We have the National Climate Change Fund, County Climate Change Fund. Then we have the community funds. So Africa Climate Change Fund, of course, is a new fund. So this is the National Climate Change Fund is a case scenario for Kenya basically, but this model could be replicated to other particular countries basically. Then we have the County Climate Change Fund, that's the subnational fund. Then we have community funds basically. Like we have the FLOCA program in Kenya and the African Activist Climate Justice Fund run by the Pan African Climate Justice Alliance. So that is sort of community funds that exist. So how do we come in and ensure that we don't antagonize, seem to be in competition with the existing funds? We sort of harmonize. So what is the existing youth climate change and climate finance coordinating body? So the coordinating body for youth engagement has been the International Youth Climate Movement, also known as YUNGO. So YUNGO has been a coordinating body for youth engagement at global level, but there are also other youth movements that tend to coordinate climate change agenda. Like for example, we have the IUCN Youth, WWF Youth, World Bank Youth. So we have a variety of that. So that's at the global level. Then we have at the regional level. Regional level, Africa, for example, has the Gaia Green Africa Youth Organization. It has the ICE, African Youth Initiative on Climate Change. Then, of course, we have at the national level, we have the National Youth Climate Change and Environmental Groups, basically, like Kenya. These are youth organizations, youth SDGs that sort of try to coordinate young people to engage in climate change. Then at the county level, we have county groupings and groups that sort to tend to coordinate young people on climate change at the subnational level. Then we have those at the very local level that tend to coordinate young people at the very basic level, basically. So this is how young people are coordinating. Then we have the proposed financial bodies. So we are proposing that at the global level, we have the Global Youth Climate Action Fund institution. Then at the subnational level, we lobby for 5% of the Africa Climate Change Fund to go to African Youth Climate Change Engagement and Agenda, 2% of the National Climate Change Fund to go to National Youth Climate Change Agenda, 1% of the County Climate Change Fund to go to County Youth Climate Change Agenda. Then we'd have the youth grants, youth baraza grants. Basically at the very basic level, we're going to have sort of committees of young people, basically, who are looking to address issues of climate change, and we are calling them the youth barazas. So we're going to provide a sort of a grant. So who is going to account? Who is going to follow the money? Who is going to ensure that the checks and balances are in place? So within the global level, we'll have the board, basically the Youth Fund Board. So when we began the introduction, I talked about the institutional oval. So the board now is what its role comes to be visible here. So the GYCAF board is sort of trying to ensure that checks and balances are in place, global money is not wasted. Then African would have, of course, the regional youth climate change secretariat, if there is, basically, to ensure that resources, if the 5% of the Africa Climate Change Fund is given to NPO, it goes to the right place. Then the National Youth Climate Change Fund will ensure that the 2% that is given to climate change goes to the right place. Then 1% of the County Climate Change Fund ensures that the County Youth Climate Change Committee ensures that this money goes to the right place. Then, of course, we'd have, of course, the Youth Climate Finance barazas, basically, that would ensure that any grant given there is put into the right, so that we do not waste the resources that we already do not have as per se. So basically, then the institution would come in and co-finance the 5% of the Africa Climate Change Fund, the 2% of the National Climate Change Fund, the 1% of the County Climate Change Fund, and provide the grant, of course, at the very grassroots level. So it would act in a sort of a co-financing mechanism. So how do we harmonize existing mechanisms and youth mechanism? So the Global Youth Climate Action Fund institution would align and mingle and form a partnership with, of course, the Green Climate Fund and the GEF. Then the Africa Climate Change Fund would, of course, find a partnership, align, sort of trying to align the funds and ensure that we work in a coordinated cooperation, intergenerational partnership approach, basically. So this is what I had in prepared place, and I welcome questions, suggestions, and any opinions, or basically on what you think about this fund. You can feel free to drop your email, your questions on email or on this chat box, and we'll be able to respond to you. So thank you for listening, and we will be welcoming and expecting some of your questions basically on this particular agenda. So thank you, and good night, good evening, good morning, and have a very nice day.